the invitation, and I think we could spend the full hour and a half debating the catch share system and how it's playing out here in Massachusetts. However, I'm not really the one to do that, and so my experience comes purely from the international realm, and even though I'm a Massachusetts resident, I rarely get involved in domestic resource management issues. So what I intend to do is hopefully to touch upon some of the points that Brian made, but also step back a little bit from the situation here at the state level in Massachusetts and at the domestic level throughout the United States, and look to what kind of innovative solutions people have found around the world for dealing with the commons property, common pool resource issue that was mentioned in the introduction, and also dealing with the fact that fisheries management is not all that is required in order to get it right in terms of ocean management. So we need to get the fisheries management right for sure, and there are a lot of different avenues for doing that. Catch shares is one system, and there are others as well. But we need to do more than that. So we need to not only get the fisheries management right, but other kinds of coastal and marine management right as well. I also want to just stop for a second and introduce, if I could, Mike Sissenwine, who's a longtime friend and colleague who actually can address the issue of catch shares, pro and con, and probably could get in a nice debate with Brian about this particular issue. Michael also has a lot of international experience, so he could easily say what I'm going to say. He probably would disagree with certain aspects of what I'm going to say. But hopefully we can engage him in the discussion that follows my thoughts. But so, and I apologize for the system, but we couldn't get it quite right. So I had thought that Professor Rothschild was going to give a PowerPoint, so I dutifully did a PowerPoint, thinking it would be odd to just speak to you all on the tails of his PowerPoint discussion, and then it turned out he didn't do a PowerPoint, but now I don't have any notes, so I have to look at my PowerPoint to remember what I have to say to you.
That's why I didn't do a PowerPoint.
So, if I could go to the first slide. Obviously, the world ocean is a very big place with, can you just?
It didn't.
Oh, it didn't? If you, can you?
Advanced here.
Ah. Okay, good.
Oh,
wonderful. Okay. So the world ocean is a very big place. There are a lot of different uses all around the world, and there are a lot of kind of multiple cumulative impacts that are happening on the world ocean all around the world, which affect the ability of people to use resources like fisheries sustainably, and also to value essentially ocean resources and ocean space to the maximum extent. Could I have the next slide? In general, fisheries management is about maintaining or enhancing productivity, so trying to make sure that things are not overutilized to the point where fish stocks collapse or fisheries resources disappear, and also in maintaining or enhancing the value of those things on the market. So fisheries management is not just about making sure that the fish or whatever the fisheries resource is there, but also that it is caught and harvested, processed, and brought to market efficiently in a way that there are wide profit margins and fishers can continue to derive livelihood from the industry. So the emphasis typically has been all around the world, as well as in the United States, on maintaining or enhancing the productivity and looking for ways that value can be maintained as well. Okay, the next slide. And if you look historically at fisheries management, and for which the United States and all of the people, the people that we just heard from Brian and Michael and other kind of leading lights in the fisheries management community, there have been real advances in fisheries management. So we went from a system all around the world in which all we did was kind of think about how many fish were being pulled out of the sea and whether those levels were sustainable. Thinking about kind of maximum sustainable yield, very simple kind of ways of, focusing in on the problem. Are we fishing too much, or is it right? To broadening out to kind of multi-species management, thinking about not only are the fisheries resources that we're taking out, are we doing it at a level that's sustainable for the fish stock and for the things that depend on that fish stock and are connected to that fish stock. So things that eat those resources and things that are fed upon by those resources, thinking about the kind of whole web of life. Are we getting it right? Two, we've now even gone beyond multi-species management into something called ecosystem-based fisheries management, which is thinking more broadly about how these ecosystems operate, how they function, what is the kind of health of these ecosystems, how can we maintain the health of those ecosystems and at the same time derive the resources, derive the benefits from those stocks. Have the next slide. But we have to remember that the fate of those fisheries resources, and in fact the fate of the oceans in terms of its health and productivity and diversity, is not just about controlling how much fish we take out and in what manner we take out. So it's not only about fisheries management. Have the next slide, please. Marine ecosystems are affected not only by what we do at sea, but also by what we do on land, way far away, high up in watersheds where you think there would be no connection whatsoever with the marine system, by what we do to water bodies, freshwater bodies like rivers. Obviously what we do on a coast has a major impact on ocean health, and then of course what we do at sea. And primarily the focus of what we do at sea in terms of the fisheries management challenge, the marine management challenge has been a focus on fisheries. It hasn't been really to deal with any of the other kinds of sectors or uses. And the next slide. So we recognize that because there are all these ways that we impact the oceans, and all those ways can potentially undermine the health and productivity of these ecosystems, that we need to go beyond. What we're really aiming for, or all around the world and at various scales, is really integrated management, where we get the fisheries management right and we figure out what levels of use are sustainable, how we can reduce bycatch levels, how we can limit destructive kinds of fishing activities and so forth. But we also get other kinds of management right in terms of managing maritime industries, citing renewable energy. It's a big issue in Massachusetts, as you all know. Figuring out how to deal with pollution from afar. So how can we maintain our wetlands so that they do for us what nature does so well, which is remove a lot of the pollutants before they get into the marine environment and so forth. And if we get truly integrated management right, then we have a number of benefits that flow from that. We have reduced user conflict, not just between the kind of classic conflicting uses, which is often fisheries and tourism are kind of pitted one against the other, but also between different parts of the fisheries sector, between fisheries and aquaculture and so forth. So if we get the integration of management right, then we're considering all these uses and all these impacts and really thinking about rational allocation of space and resources in such a way that we can maintain ocean health. Truly integrated management also does something sociologically very important, which is that by pulling people into the management planning process and the implementation of management, so the development of regulations and the management that flows out of that, by pulling those people in, you provide an opportunity for them to be heard. So you give a greater voice to all of the various kinds of user groups. And giving a voice to user groups in the planning process, as opposed to hearing from them at the point of implementation or beyond, is actually very efficient and very good way to kind of maintain harmony and also to really increase compliance with regulations. So, to draw them in and have them be heard and have them be a part of the planning process really sets you up for fewer problems down the road in terms of implementing these complicated regulatory schemes that have to do with managing very large amounts of space in a complex manner, utilizing a lot of different kinds of management tools. A truly integrated management system also allows users to understand the very complicated set of regulations that exist in places like, if we take the coast of Massachusetts off of Cape Cod, we have state jurisdiction, we have county jurisdiction, in some cases municipal kind of control over certain activities that affect the ocean or direct use of the coastal zone. Obviously, we have national regulations, federal regulations that affect ocean space as well. And it's very complicated. I don't have the map that Stephanie would have shown. Stephanie Mora was engaged with Nani early on in the discussion of talking about this topic, and unfortunately she couldn't be here today, but with the Mass Ocean Partnership, she's developed some wonderful materials to show just how complicated a situation it is here in Massachusetts, which is very emblematic of other places in the world as well. So it's complicated for people to understand what they can do where, when. And so by integrating management, and in a little while I'll talk about kind of the new approach of this administration, the national government here, and many other governments around the world, of actually displaying that integrated management in a spatial way, making people understand what can be done where, when, really helps them comply with the regulations and understand why they're being regulated, why they have limits on their behavior and activities in certain places. Can I have the next slide? It also, this kind of integrated management also is really good for industries like fisheries industries, because in a sense it gives them more security. It allows them to develop kind of business plans that they can implement over longer time frames, so they have kind of more faith in the system and more ability to understand the system and kind of predict where it may be going. Could I have the next slide? But the fact is that even though we understand that we need to integrate management, and we've been doing it quite well in the coastal zone on the land side with coastal zone management, in this country really led the world into coastal zone management, and primarily grew out of the states, and then the federal government, I think, followed suit. We still don't quite have it right in terms of integrated coastal and marine management, and neither does much of the world. So what's preventing us from kind of sustainably utilizing ocean and coastal resources in space, and integrating across those kind of two domains? And I'm going to touch on two possible constraints that I think are going to be important to the discussion, and hopefully touch back on some of the points that Brian made about catch shares and common property resources. One is a lack of capacity to do the management effectively and efficiently. And by that I mean this requires a lot of investment of time and money in terms of getting the management right, including just merely monitoring and surveillance to figure out what is being done where. You know, it's a big ocean. Even Massachusetts state's waters, we're talking about a big volume of water. And a lot of the things that are happening are going on sight unseen. It's difficult to peer under the surface of the water and really understand the impacts of human activity. So a lack of capacity is one thing. The other thing is that we're still kind of stuck in the sectoralization. The fact is, governments are structured in a way that we address things on a sector by sector basis. And there's not going to be any magical kind of, eureka moment where the government all of a sudden transforms itself into a truly integrated, infrastructure to deal with the integrated, or the whole suite of uses and impacts. So what needs to be done is that policies need to be developed that really promote kind of cross-sectoral management, planning, development of regulations, and so forth. Could I have the next slide? Now there are, I think, two sets of tools that can help us along in this kind of overcoming the constraint of lack of capacity and overcoming the sectoralization. And one is to increase revenue streams for management. And by that I mean looking for innovative financing opportunities so that government doesn't have to carry the burden alone. Whether it's state government or whether it's federal government, there ought to be a way that the private sector that derives the benefits from these essentially free resources that are out there, open access for anyone to take who wants to make the capital investment in getting the kinds of equipment that they need to get the resources. There ought to be a way to tap in to that private sector and have the business community essentially underwrite the protection and management of the resources upon which they depend. This isn't taxation, so don't get me wrong. I'm not proposing that we tax all users and we somehow make them pay essentially a user fee. What I'm talking about is getting the private sector to understand the kind of the business case for investing in the protection of things like fish nursery habitat. Now, fish nursery habitat is typically not the same habitat as where fish are caught. Fish nursery habitat is often in the estuaries, sometimes far upstream in rivers, sometimes out at seamounts, so not always the same place where fish harvest is taking place. Yet the fishing industry understands the value of fish nursery habitat. This is where young fish grow up, essentially. And if you take the habitat away or you degrade it, you've lost your fishery. So thinking about ways to engage the fishing industry, for instance, in helping to underwrite the costs of managing habitats like fish nursery habitat is one thing. Thanks. Another kind of twist on this innovative financing thing and the ability to kind of overcome this capacity constraint is to look for co-management opportunities, to actually engage the users in doing things like surveillance, sometimes enforcement, in doing management activities, in setting up, for instance, markers to show where there is a no-take area where you don't want fishing because you don't want to affect a spawning stock or something like that. All of the education and outreach activities that need to go along with management, so actually engaging the users in the management. This does a couple of things. Again, it engages them, and by engaging them, makes them more empowered, feel like they're part of the process, and less likely to rebel against regulation. And the second thing is that it also helps to share the burden of management with the government so that the costs of management are essentially brought down a little bit. The second set of tools have to do with marine spatial planning, and that's kind of what my thing is these days. So I could talk for easily 20 minutes just about marine spatial planning, or 2 days, more likely. But if we can go to the next slide, I just want to mention a couple of things that are going on in the marine spatial planning front here in Massachusetts. Just on the innovative financing, there are a lot of benefits to doing these, what we call PES schemes. PES is shorthand for Payment for Ecosystem Services. And basically, I'll just mention very quickly, the first PES project in the world was something that got people excited. It was not marine, it was terrestrial. It was a power utility in Costa Rica that was looking to how it could reduce the amount of sedimentation coming into the stream, because they were looking at having to build a big plant to remove the dirt from the water in order to generate hydroelectric power. And they looked at the cost of building this plant, and then they said, well, wait a minute, can we stop the dirt from getting into the water in the first place? And they said, so they had this eureka moment, and they said, if we paid the farmers in this watershed a small amount of money to each farmer to put in a riparian buffer on their property, or not to cut down the trees that exist on the property, then we'll be able to keep the dirt from getting into the water, and we won't have to build a plant. So for a fraction of the cost, probably 1/1000 for what it would cost to build the plant, they make an annual payment to the farmers. The farmers get essentially paid for protecting the ecosystem service, which is to maintain, reduce erosion and maintain the riparian area. So anyway, so we're looking for other kinds of ways that we can do this in the marine environment. How can we engage the tourism industry into payments for ecosystem services so they protect areas that maintain biodiversity, or create recreational values and so forth. There's no reason why fishers themselves couldn't be the recipients of these kind of payments as well. So we can think about, for instance, if you look at the kind of chain of custody for fish product, fishers grab the fish out of the sea and they take them to processing plants, and then the processing plants sell to a distributor, and distributor sells it to retail, and eventually it gets into the Safeway or Whole Foods, preferably Whole Foods for the profit margin. But anyway, so you can imagine that perhaps the Unilevers of the world, or the distributors, the big companies that are buying from the packaging plants, would want to invest in the protection of these ecosystems so that the fish keep coming, and they keep coming at a fairly low price, so they don't have to pay a huge amount of money for the fish that they want to put on their supermarket shelves. And so they might pay into the fishers in order for that management to be kind of sustainable, and in order for the fishers to do things that prevents them from impacting the ecosystems and degrading the ecosystems. Keep those ecosystem services, what nature does for us, free, going. Could I have the next slide? There are other advantages that are cropping up right now. You've probably heard about Walmart, the world's biggest seafood supplier at the moment, is on this thing to provide local products. And fisheries hasn't really been a part of the discussion. It's much more affecting agriculture, but I think fisheries is down the line. So if we can think about these kinds of payments for ecosystem services situations where you actually not only, you know, protect the ecosystem in a way, engage the users themselves in protecting the ecosystem, but you also think about how you can develop a kind of wider profit margin by capitalizing on this locavore movement and the fact that people are looking for local products. It would be a great way to kind of get over this problem that's been posed by globalization and all of that. And that's another topic. Yep, okay, I'm going to wrap it up. Next slide. The co-management lets us kind of, as I said before, us share the burden of management with the user groups. There's a lot of benefits. Again, tapping into the information that users have is one huge benefit, and it's very difficult. If any of you have ever talked to fishers or are fishers yourselves, you know that they're not they don't easily part with their kind of information. So, but if they are feeling like they're part of a process that is going to benefit them, then they'll be more likely to share the information, and that actually enhances our kind of scientific understanding of these systems and our impacts on them. Next slide, please. And I just want to briefly mention marine spatial planning because it's a kind of a framework that allows us to really get at integrated management beyond fisheries management, to think about managing shipping, energy, recreational and tourism uses, to really get at kind of going across scales too, so municipal kind of management and county management, state management across to the federal management and out even into the high seas beyond jurisdiction. Could I have the next slide? I have a minority opinion about marine spatial planning, so I have to say that I'm completely in the minority. Very few people agree with me, but for me, I see marine spatial planning as something that ultimately will lead to ocean zoning. And by that I mean that there will be a way to understand what the most important parts of the ecosystems are, what the most vulnerable parts of the ecosystems are, and using that information, then allocate uses to areas beyond these sensitive areas, so that we can think about kind of maintaining ecosystem health and at the same time use a kind of very broad way of spatially figuring out what can be done where. I've written a book which I make a shameless plug for here. But again, let me just say that in the United States, this is not a commonly held view. The United States is undergoing a marine spatial planning process, and for the most part, the United States has said this will not result in lines drawn on maps. So don't worry, it's not about ocean zoning. So we'll see. Many other countries in the world are doing ocean zoning without this kind of fear, and it seems to be working quite well. Next slide. I have a lot of examples, but I won't be able to talk to them because there's too little time, but maybe in the discussion. There are lots of examples of marine spatial planning and innovative financing and co-management going on in Africa. Very, very productive ecosystems. I'm not talking about places that are marginal in terms of fisheries production. I'm talking about very, very important fishing areas where these advances have been made. I just want to mention quickly that there are ways to engage fishers, and this is part of the co-management opportunity, one that marine spatial planning provides us, by saying to them that we can allocate parts of the ocean that are only for fishing, only for commercial fishing, and bring them to the table that way. And this has been done in places as varied as Italy, where you have fishing-only zones within parks. So within a protected area, you'll have a commercial fishing-only zone. The reason for that is to engage the commercial fishers and to make sure that they're going to comply with the regulations. So you don't want to have the fishers in a sensitive or critical area and you want to keep the fishers in the place where the system will be able to support the fishing, right? So by setting up these fishing only zones, in Brazil they're called extractive reserves. There's these territorial areas in Chile. Anyway, a lot of countries are experimenting with this, and I'll be curious to see whether the U.S. ever engages in this kind of thing as a way to engage in co-management. Finally, just to mention OSPAR, which is the Northern European Regional Seas Agreement. It's doing a lot of marine spatial planning, a lot of very interesting fisheries management. One country in OSPAR, which is Norway, is not part of the EU, and that presents it special opportunities because it can, within its marine spatial planning, within the OSPAR Convention, it can take on all of the fisheries management that it wants to. The EU countries cannot, and then we can talk about why that is if you want later. But I keep an eye on Norway because what's going on there could be very informative for what will happen here in the U.S. as all of this kind of plays out into the future. Okay, so with that, I think I'll quit.
Well, thank you. Before we go on, I'd like to give Nicholas Sisselman a chance to be ahead of home.